From our studios in the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans, welcome to our Louisiana Eats podcast series, Quick Bites. I'm Poppy Tooker. On February 29, 1918, a French wine salesman named Arnaud Cazenave opened Arnaud's restaurant in New Orleans' French Quarter. The extravagant, eccentric Count, as he dubbed himself, spent decades expanding the restaurant in size and scope, creating an institution specializing in French Creole cuisine. 100 years later, the legendary restaurant remains an institution with endless stories to tell. On this podcast, we're going to take a look at Arnaud's extended history and meet the family who are ushering it into their second century.
My name is Katie Casbarian.
I'm Germaine Wells.
And I'm Archie Casbarian.
The Louisiana Eats team recently visited Arnaud's to speak with the Casbarian family, the second and current family running Arnaud's, which they took over in 1978. Until then, Count Arnaud Cazenave's daughter, Germaine Wells, was in charge. Like her father, Germaine was a character. She reigned as queen in over 20 carnival balls, and Arnaud's was her stage. For decades, Germaine resisted offers to hand over the keys to her father's treasured restaurant. That all changed when she met the late Archie Casbarian Sr. and his wife Jane in the late 70s. I asked Jane to take us back to those days.
Well, Archie was in the hotel business, and he ran the Royal Orleans and then the Royal Sonesta. And he loved food and beverage. That's what he was wonderful at. And he always said he wanted to be a restaurateur. He'd been offered the Royal Sonesta, the corporate office was in Boston, and he didn't want to go back there. He loved New Orleans. He did not want to leave New Orleans. All of a sudden, Arnaud's was up for grabs, and he worked very hard to get it because everybody in town wanted it. But for some reason, Germaine Wells took a liking to him.
Germaine saw a little bit of her father in Archie. He shared the Count's European flair with his love for good cigars, handsome clothes, and fine dining. Archie and Germaine spent many lunches together talking business at the Royal Sonesta, where Archie was the general manager.
She called him Sonny. She couldn't remember his name, but anyway. And her lawyer, George Camber, was with her. And it was just, Archie could drink, but my goodness, he would tell all the waiters, put water in mine or something, and then she got suspicious. And she grabbed his drink one day and saw it was water, and that was it. He had to go back to vodka. She was having, heart failure, and so she had vodka and cranberry juice because she thought the cranberry juice would help her heart, but it didn't stop her drinking. She could really drink.
Seems logical.
Yeah.
I like her style.
So anyway, it was months and months and months and months, and finally she said his initials were the same as her father, Arnaud Cazenave. He smoked cigars, and he liked to tell stories, and he liked brandy. Everything was just like her dad. So that's how we got in this deal. And of course, did it on a wing and a prayer because we had no money.
And by 1978, Arnaud's was in desperate need of a makeover. Since Count Arnaud's death 3 decades earlier, the quality of the dining experience was on the decline. Even the buildings that housed the restaurant were in great disrepair.
The place needed fixing from head to foot. She had never touched the place. As she got older, she would close off a room.
Mm-hmm. That was the solution to fixing.
The solution is the roof, if it's leaking, just close the room, or if there are pigeons flying around, just close the room and, forget about it. So it was quite an undertaking.
Despite a lack of funds and their parents' reservations, both Archie and Jane were confident that they could turn the place around.
They thought we were crazy when they first came in here, but we could see what a wonderful old place it was and how marvelous it could be. We did the downstairs and the kitchen, and we were able to open March 1st of '79, which was really unbelievable. And then after she died, we were able to purchase the restaurant.
Germaine Wells passed away in December 1983, but a month before her death, Jane and Archie opened a museum that paid tribute to her days as Carnival Queen. The gowns Germaine wore over the years were left in 2 closets at Arnaud's, which they took out, cleaned, and made into an exhibit.
They're beautiful. You don't find things like that anymore. And they go back to when the first costume of hers was she was the queen and her father was the king. And it was a part of Carnival that visitors to the city really don't get to see. So anyway, we had a grand opening party up in the Count's room. And it just so happened her favorite dress, she had a gold lame number. She had 2 of them. And she said, "Sonny, I'll wear that. And if you get me a crown and a scepter, I'll be your queen for the evening," she told him. And they get to the top of the steps, and he's kind of pulling her up because she was old. Yeah. Everything was coming out. So anyway, she said, "Sonny, have you ever been a king before?" And he said, "No, Mrs. Wells, I haven't." So she said, "Well, when I stop, you just follow me." And so they did it. Then she told him that night that when she died, she wanted to be buried in that dress. And so when she did die the next month, he called her attorney and said, "This is what she told me." And sure enough, she was buried in that dress, that gold lame. And the other one's up there in the museum.
I'm Poppy Tooker, and you're listening to a Louisiana Eats Quick Bite. Our conversation with the Casbarians continues in a moment, but first, a look back at our archives. Katie Casbarian was one of our first guests on Louisiana Eats when the show began broadcasting in 2010. Our second episode, to be exact. Her father, Archie, had passed away just a year prior, and Katie spoke with us then about following in his footsteps. Let's listen to what Katie had to say in 2010 about her father's death and legacy. Katie, you literally grew up at the almost century-old venerable New Orleans institution, Arnaud's Restaurant. What are your earliest memories of eating there?
I have so many. We spent our entire childhood there. Some of my favorites were after school. My father had set up an office for my brother and I to do our homework, and we'd always look forward to Monday afternoon family meal with the rest of the team. We'd have red beans and rice and cornbread. We look forward to it every week. It was so delicious. And anything from birthday celebrations that we'd have, or weddings, engagements, everything centered about food and celebration.
Our listeners may not know what you mean when you say family meal. It wasn't just your immediate family that you were sitting down with.
No, it was with the entire Arnaud's team. All the employees gather at around 4:30, 4:45, 5 o'clock, and have dinner together before the start of the shift. And all of our employees have always been extended family members, so it was nice to be part of it.
Your professional life has you walking literally in your dad's footsteps. I know we all miss your dad and his elegant presence there at Arnaud's. Do you find yourself doing things a certain way because that's how he did it?
Yeah, I think we've always been very similar. Even as a child, I had some similar tendencies that he did. Everything had to be just done in the way I wanted it done, and that was very much like how he was. Whether that was right or wrong, it just was how it was. And so I still am like that to a certain degree. I think I look more like him now. I certainly have a love of vodka on the rocks with 3 olives like he did. And I'd like to think that I have the same passion that he does for the hospitality industry, and certainly for Arnaud's, and for our family.
Katie, with all the birthday celebrations and family fun you shared with your dad at Arnaud's, is there anything that stands out in your memory?
My father made every celebration so special. He spent so much time just making really certain birthdays when you just thought you were going to celebrate with a few people, he made it into a big dinner party, or you just thought you were going to order off the menu. He planned a really elaborate dinner. And for my brother's engagement party, he brought in lighted ice sculptures for the dessert, and he just always did something a little bit special. He was so thoughtful and really just such a wonderful man. He made everyone feel so important, so special. And another thing, every day we'd have lunch together. I was so lucky in that I got to work with him in my professional life, and was lucky because he was a wonderful father. But he was my mentor, and I feel very fortunate that I got to work with him for the few years that I did.
Katie Casbarian, back in 2010, remembering her father Archie. And now, back to our look at Arnaud's on its 100th birthday. With the death of Germaine Wells in 1983, one chapter of Arnaud's history ended and a new one began, with the Casbarians leading the charge. For over 30 years, Archie and Jane took Arnaud's to new heights, all the while raising their children, Katie and Archie Jr., who run the restaurant today. I asked Jane how old her children were when they acquired the restaurant.
We got it in December of 78, so Katie was not quite 1. She was 11 months old, I guess. So Archie would have been 3.
But I mean, we can remember Katie and I as children. We grew up here. We used to ride our big wheels around, our big wheel bicycles in the dining room
on Saturdays when we were closed.
We'd lock each other in dark rooms and play hide and seek and scare each other. And
we don't know any other way to grow up, and we don't know any other home than this one. And I mean, after school, we used to come here and do our homework, and it wasn't long after that before we were working here every summer. And
What were your first jobs here?
we did everything.
Good question,
Worked in the kitchen a lot, prepping.
Worked in the receiving area, bringing in deliveries, just the general jack of all trades, fixing things. And I think our father and mother, both had an attitude of not ever asking somebody to do something that you weren't willing to do yourself. And so we've done all the dirty jobs. And
how about Dad with his light bulb and his circuit breaker charts? He'd have Archie do.
This place it's so old, it's so big, the electric system was just so expansive, and of course when something goes wrong, there's no telling what switch controls what, and so we spent months tracking it all down and trying to figure out what was what, and that was one of my jobs.
That was your favorite job.
Oh, boy.
Keeping the restaurant in shape was no easy task, given its age and how expansive it is.
What is it, 12 buildings, 32,700 square feet or something.
17 dining rooms.
The count was very ambitious.
The count
My goodness.
owned from the park to
On
all
Bourbon
the,
Street.
all the way down to almost to Dauphine Street. And the Creole Cottage, Germaine owned it. And when we took over in 78, she took that over as her bar. She wanted to have her own space. Well, that didn't last too long. And then I think Miss Ruby came in and operated there for a while. And then this was, Ramalade, that space was, what was it called? Paddock Lounge. Mrs. Paddock Lounge was a girlfriend of the Count's. So that's how, and I think when she died, Germaine leased it out. So we had to wait for that lease to come up before we could, he wanted to stay there, but we wanted it for ourselves.
To the credit of Arnaud Cazenave, he had the foresight to acquire all of this property, which today, in its entirety, Arnaud's makes up almost an entire city block, and to be able to put that together now is almost impossible. It would take an enormous amount of money.
I can't even imagine.
It's really amazing what he was able to put together, and the fact that it is all cobbled together into one restaurant that sort of flows and makes sense is even the most amazing part of all. I mean, it is a little curious in the different crooks and diversions and dog legs in the hallways here, so it wasn't built to be a restaurant, but in its own way it works.
Arnaud's current success can be attributed to the Casbarians' ability to present fresh ideas while maintaining a link to the past. Even the menu maintains a common thread with the Count. But when Archie and Jane took over the menu, there were some items on there that they had no problems getting rid of, including potatoes, cooked in more ways than I can easily name.
Well, that and the Hawaiian ham and pineapple, and there was spaghetti and meatballs. You could have two or one. Things that made no sense in a French restaurant. A few of the items we had recipes for, but the recipes made no sense whatsoever. So that took a lot of doing. We had to research if they were classic dishes, what should they have tasted like. We used to have to buy the remoulade sauce from Germaine, and she had a guy who worked for her.
It's like the original Al Copeland.
Yeah.
Because he wouldn't give up the recipe.
Right.
I mean, we were kind of upset because he made it in this big old nasty wooden vat, and it didn't look like they ever washed it, and we were forced to buy it. Anyway, when she died, we got the recipe. Well, of course, it didn't taste the way it should. The other thing was the Meunier sauce. And at that time, Warren LaRuth was doing consulting work because he was a food chemist. And he worked with us, and we perfected the remoulade sauce and the Meunier sauce. He remembered them, because he lived here all his life. But we worked and worked and worked and went through a lot of recipes until we got it right. Because the sauce had to be just the right amount of spice so you get the hit on the third shrimp at the third bite. And any new recipe we type up, keep refining it, and then once it's okayed, it goes in a book, it's stamped, and so the cooks all know you have to use this recipe.
Souffle potatoes are another extremely amazing and unique thing that you all do here, and you do it as beautifully or better than anyone else. Explain to people who maybe never had a pomme souffle what that magic is.
Well, it's essentially a beautifully cut, perfectly rectangular potato that's fried twice so that it puffs up magically. And when you dip it in béarnaise, it's like the perfect bite you ever had, particularly if you have it and chase it with a French 75. But we, if you can believe, have one gentleman that all he does all day long is cut souffle potatoes. It's his sole responsibility. His name is Sam, and he's been working with us for probably
almost 20 years.
Almost
More
20
than that,
years,
I bet.
maybe closer to 30.
Well, an enormous operation like this requires a lot of help. How many employees on average do you all have?
We have about 220 employees here.
Most of the people that are here now are holdovers from from my mother and father's time, going back, and we're very fortunate here. We try to foster a very family sort of atmosphere and not projecting a corporate sort of atmosphere.
Do you have some stories about them? Are there some people who you can tell us about, either who are still here or who were here?
Yes, we do have a lot of characters, as with any any restaurant. For those that have ever worked in one, it's a cast of characters and three-ring circus in a lot of times. But our former maitre d', who's still here with us, Charles Abiad, has a habit of, or a tradition of, doing a headstand on his birthday every year here at the restaurant. And he's not as young as he used to be, and so we're really trying to discourage him.
Please stop doing that. But he does it still. He says it keeps him young, so we don't want to.
Well, young until his neck snaps.
Yeah,
but we're hoping that doesn't happen.
Tell me about the kitchen staff. How big of a crew is in there?
We have a very large kitchen by by almost any restaurant.
Isn't it? I
standard.
believe is it correct that it is the largest kitchen? At least at one time, I know you all held that distinction for having the largest restaurant
It
kitchen.
may well be, and when my father, when they redid my mother and father redid the kitchen, they brought in, a national kitchen design firm to come down here. That was a contact from the hotel days.
It's Archie's roommate.
Yeah, from hotel school.
Yeah.
And so they came down, and my mother can speak more to this, but everything that was done in the kitchen was every detail and design element was done in preparation for big volume, and obviously they had a big idea of what this place was going to become.
Archie, coming from the hotel business, was sick and tired of going to hotels where the kitchen was the last thought when they were building these hotels, and so it wasn't big enough to handle the volume. So he knew, well, first of all, he knew it wasn't going to be a mom and pop operation, and that we didn't open the upstairs at first, but he knew we would, and that there was a possibility that we could do 1,000 people at a time, and he wanted to be prepared for it. The other interesting thing is he ran this like a hotel, and he was the first restaurateur to have department heads. We had the housekeeping and the storekeeper and the banquet and the chef and the sales department. No restaurant in town had a sales department. Now they all do. But he knew we had to have a sales department to go out and get business to fill these seats, So I think he really was pretty special in that respect, that he really brought a lot to the restaurant business.
He was just an incredible visionary. He
Yeah,
really was,
yeah.
and I know you all miss him
Oh, we do.
tremendously. How long has he been gone?
9 years.
Oh my goodness.
He was so brilliant, so talented. I mean, you would love him. Could tell a good story. He's a party boy, but really smart and hardworking, very hardworking.
What do you see as his legacy here?
Well, just this whole place. I mean, wasn't me.
And then there'd be these two.
And these, yeah. He trained these wonderful children, and attention to detail. He really would, like I said, would drive you crazy, but it had to be done a certain way, and he was right.
Have you all ever gotten to a point in the last 9 years when you're trying to make a decision? Do you say, well, what would Archie do?
I'd say every day, probably. Yeah.
I think we live just wanting to make him proud of what we do, and
Both of them.
Yeah, absolutely. My mother and my father, but there are big shoes to fill for both of them, and I'm not sure that we're worthy to fill them just yet.
You are.
But we certainly, every decision that we make is we take that into account of what would he do? Would he be proud of this? And that allows us to feel confident in what we're doing.
And again, back to his vision, when it got bad and he was legally blind, they worked with him, because he couldn't read something, they'd read it to him. So they worked side by side with him and really got a good training from him towards the end, the last years.
And I have to say, we talk we've been talking about my father and my mother, and and what I'm most proud of about what they both have done is just that I'm not sure that Arnaud's, but for them, would be what it is right now, whether it would look this way, whether people would continue to come to Arnaud's, whether another operator would have tried to keep the continuity through the decades and yet still build on the quality, whether it would be completely different,
But it was it's a wonderful, grand old place, and we wanted it to be like it, if it wasn't, like it should have been in 1918. And really, it is a very special place, and I've been very lucky to have been a part of it.
At 100 years, Arnaud's has made its unique mark alongside New Orleans legends like Antoine's and Galatoire's. I asked the Casbarians what they believe Arnaud's contributions have been to New Orleans cuisine.
Well, I mean, a lot of the oyster dishes, Bienville, that's so famous now, that was originated here. And I think the Count, when they did the shrimp remoulade, before it wasn't that spicy sauce, it was probably the French remoulade that everybody did. And back to the old girls, thank God all these old girls are here, because we are losing, I think, our Creole cuisine. I mean, everybody's doing this new, all this, I call it tortured food, but which is so popular, all these new restaurants, but we don't want to lose,
And I think the main thing is with any restaurant is it's not just the food, it's not just the service, it's not just the ambiance of a place that makes something special. It's the convergence of all those things. And when you can hit the mark on all three of those things, then it really makes for something special. And I think that's what Arnaud's does. And some of these old dishes that are forgotten, I think when your focus is on quality and it's on the flavor, that you can never go wrong.
That was Jane, Katie, and Archie Casbarian, proprietors of Arnaud's Restaurant. Help celebrate its 100th birthday by making a reservation today. Don't miss a delicious upcoming serving of Louisiana Eats by subscribing to our podcast. Also, visit poppytooker.com for lots more recipes and delicious food ideas. Music for today's podcast came from Frames in Motion. Louisiana Eats original theme music by Johnny Sketch and the Dirty Notes. Thanks to Joe Schreiner and Reggie Morris, who produced this podcast, as well as Thomas Walsh for archival material. I'm Poppy Tooker. Thanks for listening. And thanks to our major sponsors, Camellia Beans, Zatarain's, French Market Coffee, and Rouse's Markets. Visit poppytooker.com to see a full list of our partners. This Louisiana Eats Quick Bite was produced by Poppy Tooker Broadcasting.